When the Son of Humanity comes, will he find faith on earth? These words from 2,000 years ago are the defining question of our time. This week, the House Committee on the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol concluded its hearings. We have seen indisputable evidence that politicians continue to use false claims of electoral fraud to secure their own power. Last month, the governors of Florida and Texas falsely promised jobs and resettlement help to asylum seekers who they sent to Washington, D.C. and Martha's Vineyard. They used immigrants, including children, as part of a political stunt. And this action echoes the way that black Southerners were bussed out of the South by segregationist white citizen councils to cities with prominent integrationist leaders in 1962. This week, in Ukraine and Iran, people were slaughtered because of a distant political agenda, because of an ideology. And here at home, we see a huge number of children living without homes on the street. We see terrible poverty and neglect everywhere we turn. When the Son of Humanity comes, will he find faith on earth? In the face of heartbreaking cruelty and dishonesty of his own time, Jesus tells his friends, quote, a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. Jesus tells this story near to the end of his own journey to Jerusalem, as he talks about the end of time when God's realm of justice, peace, and love will come. Many passages in the Hebrew Bible insist that the powerful have a special responsibility to widows, strangers, and orphans. These groups are vulnerable because they have no male relatives to defend themselves. And although widows in the Bible, they seem tenacious, like Ruth or the widow of Zarephath in the story of Elijah, they are resourceful and they have great initiative. And yet, they represent vulnerability, just as the judge represents power. So a widow comes to a judge seeking justice. He does not believe in God. He doesn't care what other people think. He refuses to help her until he reasons that, quote, because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out. I want to tell you two things about the Greek New Testament that describe this story. The first way in which the Greek is different from the English translation is that when the widow says that he does not want the widow to wear him out, the literal Greek word is huporiatse, and it means to give someone a black eye, like in boxing. And so the judge doesn't want the widow to give him a black eye, to embarrass him or injure his reputation. And the second thing about reading this text in Greek is that it much more strongly emphasizes the urgency, impatience, and conviction that Jesus feels about this. Greek uses double negatives to make things more emphatic. It's almost as if Jesus were to raise his voice or to underline what he means. So a more literal translation of what Jesus said would be this: and will not God give vengeance to his chosen ones who are crying day and night, and be impatient to help them? The point is not that God resembles the unjust judge. In almost every respect, Jesus describes God as the opposite. The judge is self-centered. He only uses people. But God is full of love, impatient for his children to thrive. Jesus is unafraid to be humiliated for our sake. So the purpose of this story is to help us to trust God and to persist in prayer. Today I want to give you one picture of what a faithless world looks like, and then I want to show you what faith can do in our life. In college, I had a friend who was a woman, and her favorite Hemingway story was Ernest Hemingway's The Short, Happy Life of Frances Macomber. Now, this always worried me about her, partly because of the story's misogyny, but mostly because of its position with regard to faith. We meet Frances Macomber as a 35-year-old American business tycoon on safari in East Africa. And as the story unfolds, we gradually come to realize that he has committed the cardinal sin in the universe of Hemingway fiction. The day before, he betrayed his manliness, and he ran in fear from a wounded lion who was hidden in the high grass. Margot, his wife, she doesn't try to comfort him in his humiliation. Instead, she despises his cowardice, and as a consequence, she sleeps with the safari leader that night. Now, Hemingway himself just seemed to hate his own fictitious character because he wouldn't leave his wife, because he would take anything from her. And so the next day, the group goes in pursuit of a buffalo. It's dangerous. And then, suddenly, and in a moment of almost religious conversion, Macomber changes. Hemingway writes that, quote, "For the first time in his life, he felt wholly without fear. Instead of fear, he had a feeling of a definite elation." So the safari leader admires this new courage, and his wife fears it because she no longer has the power to make him ashamed of being afraid. So, like the 8:30 people, you might be sitting in your seats and wondering, why is it called The Short, Happy Life of Frances Macomber? Only moments later, as Macomber tries to flush the buffalo out of the long grass, quote, he feels a sudden, white-hot, blinding flash explode inside his head. And that was all he ever felt. Although his wife claimed she was aiming at the buffalo, she shot him in the back of the head. It's an upsetting story, so I'll let you pull yourself together. At the 8:30 service, they just started laughing because it's so hard. They just didn't have any other response. But the question is the same, isn't it? When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? In Hemingway's universe, there is no faith. Men can never depend on women or on other men. Every person is either a conquest or an adversary. The individual can only rely on an elusive courage that comes miraculously from within, an irrational bravery which completely isolates us from each other. The theologian HRichardNiebuhr reminds us that faith is not just about our relation to God. It is so much more about our relation to each other. Faith means being connected to, supported by, dependent upon, all of us together. Niebuhr writes, we see this possibility that human history will come to its end in the gangrenous corruption of a social life in which every promise, contract, treaty, and word of honor is given and received in deception and distrust. If human beings can no longer have faith in each other, can they exist as human beings? What shall we do with all this in the time before the second coming of Christ? We need to pray and not lose hope. We also need to be people of honesty and integrity. We need to listen to and care for each other. To use the language of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, we need to treat other people as ends in themselves rather than as means to our own goals. The heartbreaking sin of this judge was his inability to see the humanity of the widow in front of him. I have a friend named Sue Everson. She's a wonderful person. She's also one of the world's greatest authorities on hopelessness. As a medical researcher, she studies hopelessness and the effect that it has on our health. One of her most startling statistics is that people who feel hopeless are 20% more likely to die in the next 4 years from a stroke. So hopelessness, feeling hopeless, is just as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes every day in terms of its effect on your likelihood to have a stroke. Sue scientifically studies how religion seems to help people to not be so hopeless. Today, with churches around the world, we are celebrating the Children's Sabbath. Now, a central part of what we do together involves our care for children and families, not just on Sundays, but every day of the week at Cathedral School for Boys and at the community preschool. We teach people, children, how to listen spiritually, how to pray, how to not lose heart. Professor Lisa Miller has been our guest on the forum twice. She's an expert, and she argues that denying our spirituality is not just untrue, but unhealthy for us, and especially unhealthy for children. So, as a researcher in psychology, she uses techniques ranging from twin studies to neuroimaging, and she is coming to a new appreciation for just how important spirituality is for all human flourishing. Miller claims that children have a special kind of natural spirituality, that this interest in the holy, this, quote, direct sense of the heartbeat of the living universe precedes and transcends language, culture, and religion. This spirituality, she says, and this is so important for us as parents and for people who are concerned with children, this spirituality protects us, not completely, but it protects us to some extent from depression, anxiety, from suffering with a tendency to misuse alcohol and drugs. So what is the most important thing that we can do as adults for children? We can support their Sunday school teachers. We can help the families who gather here and give them support during these critical years. We can take the questions of children seriously, and we can listen to them. And so the conversation continues every week here. In life, we are continually asking and being asked a simple question. Do you believe in me? Do you? Seeing what is happening in the world, it is easy to struggle with a crisis of faith right now, a crisis of trust. I trust God, but I do not know. I do not know that when the Son comes again, he will find faith on earth. And yet at the same time, I feel remarkably supported and loved by the life I find here at Grace Cathedral. C.S. Lewis writes that faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of changing moods. Because of this, he says we need to pray every day. We need to consider the Christian ideals in some extent every day because we lose these things. We need to worship because we have to be continuously reminded of what we believe. Belief has to be fed. C.S. Lewis writes that people do not cease to become Christian because of a good argument, but because they simply drift away, often into hopelessness. Kathleen Norris writes, prayer is not asking for what you think you want, but asking to be changed in ways you cannot imagine, to be made more grateful, more able to see the good in what you have been given, instead of always grieving for what might have been. My friends, pray always, and do not lose heart. Be trustworthy, and take care of the children. when the Son of Humanity comes, may he find faith on earth.